Hello everyone. This lecture is on culture and communication in ancient India. It is a part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will give you an idea of how culture and communication developed in ancient India. Any discussion on culture and communication during the period has to be understood without delinking these two concepts. In fact, culture, through its symbolic and material forms, communicated ideas about society. Culture, in this sense, is actually an entire way of life of humans, of which communication is an integral part. The relationship of culture and communication tells us that communication is deeply embedded into culture of any society. And the culture of any society is inextricably connected to and also a product of our day-to-day practices through which we make our living. Therefore, communication and culture cannot be separated from each other and from the mode of living of people in any era. We define communication as encompassing the multiple circuits of exchange and circulation of goods, people and messages. This brings communication close to culture and its materiality . And this lecture will broaden up the sense, the base and scope of communication studies. It will outline the contours of development on the basis of material, symbolic and literary forms to delineate on culture and communication in ancient India. Let us begin. Any discussion on media and communication invariably leads us to equate it with mass-mediated, formally organized and industrialized mode of communication. In the process, we forget that people did communicate prior to industrialized mode of communication, which was introduced in India. Hence, any understanding of communication has to look at cultural traditions that were communicative and binding in any society. This lecture attempts to showcase the richness of cultural traditions that informed communication and continued till date even in the age of informatics. Besides, such periodization of and historical constellation may not be of much help to understand culture and communication. However, for a heuristic purpose, such periodization may be used. Thus, we will study traditions as a continuity rather than rupture from each historical epoch to the other. The discussion on culture and communication in ancient India raises various questions related to the very idea of ancient in ancient India. When does it begin and when does it end in India? Although historians have made attempts to resolve this problem many a times, can one be satisfied with such periodization, specifically related to understanding culture and communication? The idea of ancient is not a monolithic category. There are multiple traditions and historical constellations within ancient India. As Chaudhary points out, that the effort to periodize Indian history is not free from danger and it is problematic. In this regard, Chaudhary cites D.D. Kosambi and his critique of a Soviet Indologist, D.A. Sulayan, by saying the following. India is not mathematical point but a large country, a subcontinent with the utmost diversity of natural environment, language, historical development. Neither in the means of production nor in the stages of social development was there overall homogeneity in the oldest times. Centuries must be allowed to pass before comparable stages of productive and social relationships may be established between the Indus Valley, Bengal and Malabar. Even then, important differences remain which makes periodization for India as a whole almost impossible, except with the broadest margin. It is true that our sense of modern history writing is shaped by the colonial forms of knowledge. The colonial interests of governance of stereotyped Indian society as ahistorical, or that India has no history, thereby postulating the ideological canvas justifying their role. As we will discuss further, the ancient Indian history consists primarily of oral traditions till the advent of writing, and even after that. Britishers' sense of history did not allow them to read Indian history through oral tradition. They completely ignored it. Secondly, Britishers were preoccupied with the idea that India has no literature representing its past in a linear fashion. Alexander Dow, in the History of Hindustan, asserts that Britishers' perception of history as a linear narrative obscured their knowledge apparatus towards the abundance of history of the Indian subcontinent. For instance, Indian history moves from a primitive form of living to Indus Valley civilization, a highly advanced and urbanized civilization. A linear pattern of history informs us that the next stage in the history should be further advanced in terms of material and symbolic culture. On the contrary, the civilization in the Indian subcontinent takes completely a different turn with the disappearance of Indus Valley civilization and the advent of Aryans, who primarily lived as nomadic pastorals in the beginning, and finally in the 6th century BC, the revival of urbanization is astonishing. At the same time, the coexistence of various tribals and contending civilizational patterns molds the history further into different twists. Let us discuss the material culture in ancient India. The early forms of human existence and culture may be witnessed through the rock shelters of Bhimbetaka at Madhya Pradesh. Such rock shelters have paintings drawn and engraved on caves. The cave shelter paintings tell us how symbolic communication and culture are inseparable. It also points to the physicality of communication and cultural diffusion. Such cave paintings are glaring examples of how the early habitation were intrinsically innovative and creative. The pictorial and graphic description of activities through rock art and paintings is a testimony to it. Let us discuss these cave paintings of Bhimbetka. Bhimbetka cave paintings exemplify one of the earliest forms of rituals and symbolic conduct amongst human beings, which is a reflection of the whole way of life lived by hunter-gatherers. Not only that, these rocks on which the paintings are made were themselves the places of shelter of humans in those times. The rock paintings show animals being hunted by men with bow and arrow. There is a striking painting of a woman carrying a load. These paintings reflect that men and women both participated in the food gathering and hunting activities together. There is no suggestion of agricultural or even pastoral activities in these paintings. Not only this, but the changes in shape of stone tools from rough to more refined tools narrate the story of a very important change in their material life. The new tools made it easier to cultivate the soil. The knowledge about cultivation and to transform the stone to axe to clear the forest for agricultural purpose is a definite shift in the knowledge of the early habitation. Changes in the shapes of tools is also an indication of the change in habitation. The stone required for making stone tools for digging the soil are easily available in hills and forests rather than rivers. So, rivers and rocks became the sites of human settlements as their survival through hunting is dependent on stone tools, which are either available nearby rivers or hills. So, you have seen how culture and communication is integral to the mode of survival. It guides the mode of habitation, size of a family, types of tools, verbal and non-verbal forms of communication, art and artifacts, and everything that is essential for humans to live as a social and emotional being. The beginning of agriculture and domestication, which was the Neolithic revolution of animals, changed the course of human history. Its ultimate effect was revolutionary as it changed the processes of obtaining food and establishing new types of links between humans, animals, and land. A larger production of food had further led to a growth in population. A higher density of population in places where agriculture was practiced brought about a more sedentary population. Indus civilization is the first urban civilization that emerged in the Indian subcontinent. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were the earliest cities. One of the most outstanding features of the Indus cities was that they were well planned. Cities provide networks of communication in several ways connected to its cultural life. Indus cities were on the banks of rivers so as to facilitate the transportation of goods. The roads were oriented to the cardinal directions, which assisted civic facilities, particularly the carefully articulated drainage system, where house drains were linked to those of the street. Drain system and roads can be seen as the nerve system of the body that are crucial for the flow of blood. So, similarly, an efficient drain system is important for the flow of water, and roads are crucial for transportation of goods and people. These are central aspects of urban culture and communication. Another important feature of the city life is trade and commerce. The emergence of cities is a sign that agriculture has advanced to the level where surplus can be produced, and a class of people lived on such surplus agricultural production in cities. This required the storage and transportation of the surplus production together with other resources from countryside to cities. The two cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro are identified as granaries, which means cities where the surplus production used to be stored for further transportation and trade. Along with this, vessels of different sizes are found at Indus sites, which indicate that a settled life with properly stored grain was in action. These vessels can be counted as physical forms of cultural communication. Another aspect of discussion is the burials of Indus rituals itself as a cultural form of expression and communication. The burials found at the Indus sites signify that the Harappans believed in the notion of afterlife. This is said on the basis of the fact that artifacts such as ornaments, bronze mirrors are found with the female bodies. Other items found in the graves are pottery. It is said that wheel carts were in use by this time for transportation of goods and people. Wheeled vehicles played a significant role in the transportation and trade in urban life. In fact, with the emergence of urbanism, wheeled vehicles became common. Hence, the spread of the wheel cart becomes a momentous event, for it made heavy transport possible. Animals like ox were used to pull the cart. The transportation highlighted the presence of trade. Indus cities were the centers of crafted items that were traded overland and across the seas. Farmers brought raw material to the cities, and city people made crafts such as terracotta pots, beads, and many more. The uniformity in the style of many artifacts found at various places within the Indus territory gives the impression of considerable long distance trade. The river Indus served as the high waterway through which most of this trade was carried out. They also traded with Mesopotamian cities. The Harappan culture belongs to Bronze Age, which means that by now, along with stone, humans had learned to make tools from copper and bronze that were used extensively during this period. The copper ore came from Rajasthan and was available in sufficient quantity for export of the metal to the west. Lothal, which is now in Gujarat, may be described as a seaport and was a hub of exchange and a place where finished products of the craft workshops were gathered, stored and transported. Trade signifies that writing must have developed in its rudimentary forms by now. Indus writing comes to us in the form of short inscriptions on stamp seals of various materials. The Indus seals are a unique source available to us to know the existence of Indus script. There is some kind of pictorial writing too on them. Since this pictorial script has not been deciphered, yet our knowledge about the Harappans is largely limited to these pictures only. Now, when we talk about seals, there is another crucial aspect of culture and communication in urban life that comes to picture. Have you thought, how were goods bought and sold in such a scale of local and long distance trade? Definitely this cannot be managed only through barter system. There is a possibility that some seals served as token for goods. Indus seals presents evidence of one of the earliest forms of writing in the Indian subcontinent. It is quite obvious that writing would have emerged as trade requires a documentation of transactions. All these developments indicate that there existed an organized labor for construction work and other related activities. It also signifies that a certain form of hierarchy developed with the urbanization and trade. So, you have seen that advancements in material conditions of living through the knowledge of agriculture and surplus production furthered the development of urban life centered around craft production and trade, leading to the formation of hierarchies in societies. With these developments, the culture and communication of the Harappan civilization marks parallel changes with the construction of well-planned cities, use of standard size baked bricks, transportation of surplus food and crafts over land through wheeled vehicles and across seas, and finally writing in its earliest forms to account for the trade transactions. Cultural texts in ancient India reflect a rich repertoire of linguistic and interpretative traditions experienced through senses or communicated through language. These interpretative traditions reflect the nature of vibrance in communities engaged in nurturing Indian traditions for more than 1,000 years. By fixing the meaning of Shrutis from the Vedas, Smritis, which is philosophical and technical treatises, that is Shastras, and Kavyas, which are the literary compositions. As Kapoor points out, that the Indian tradition may not be looked at in a Western sense of tradition vis-a-vis modernity. On the contrary, it has to be viewed as continuous, pervasive, and lives in the minds and lifestyles of the average Indian. The Indian intellectual traditions may be viewed through writings of the scholars, thinkers, texts, and conceptual structures as reflected in various domains of human thought and experience. In spite of historical loss and destruction, these materials are still a marker in various intellectual fields. The thought in the disciplines are governed and added by interpretative literature built around the primary text. Most of these texts are empirical in nature. That is, the conceptual structures informed by the primary texts are based on observations and practiced by the people. Hence, they may not be treated as normative. However, after acquiring a status being accorded through the intellectual traditions, they are used as normative texts. Since the tradition was oral, all the texts were constituted and communicated as oral texts. However, these texts were language centered as Shabd. In fact, Shabd is most important, and precision and definition in terms of the established history tells us that the earliest cultural texts available to us are the Vedas, Rig Veda being the earliest. Interestingly, these texts were transmitted orally from one generation to another before they were written down. We find an emphasis on Shruti, that which is heard, and Smriti, that which is memorized. This means that the hymns were memorized and transmitted orally. Therefore, correct articulation of the sound was essential that will determine the efficacy of the ritual texts. This emphasis on correct pronunciation through meticulous memorization confined the Vedic corpus to a small and selected group of castes claiming superior knowledge. Unlike Vedic corpus, the epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, which were also recited orally in the beginning, were more open transmission. This is the reason we have a rich and plural cultural tradition of epics in South Asia. The interface between this orality and literary tradition is further demonstrated in the institution of learning, that is, Guru Shishya Parampara. Since the Shruti and Smriti of the Vedic corpus is controlled and confined to specific social groups, it is only the boys of these groups who were sent to the gurus. In the forest hermitage of this institution of learning, the training of Shishya was largely oral. With the beginning of writing during Ashok's rule in ancient history, it is an event that marked a remarkable shift in the cultural tradition. The earliest evidences of writing other than the Harappan script in Indian subcontinent are Ashok's inscriptions engraved with his edicts. His edicts are written in Prakrit language. His inscriptions provide the earliest evidence of the use of Brahmi script, which is the Indian script known for writing of Sanskrit and Prakrit. Ashoka's inscriptions reflect a close proximity of emergence of writing and trade. The emergence of modern rural Ashok and the beginning of writing are related events in the Indian history. It is not without reasons that his inscriptions were engraved in prominent places, either near the towns or on important trade and travel routes. It is noteworthy that unlike Sanskrit, Prakrit was a language spoken by the people at large. Therefore, it was imperative for the ruler to have used the local script so as to communicate with a larger number of people. But this does not mean that literacy was common amongst people in modern empire. It required qualification only for a certain group of people such as monks and officers of the modern administration. The clusters of inscriptions in Karnataka were not in their local language. This demonstrates that the edicts were not always meant for people in general. Buddhist Sangha emphasized on recording the teachings of Buddha, which made literacy essential for monks. Edicts at the monastic sites are indicative of the ruler's intention of building relationship with Buddhist Sangha. Panini is known for composing the grammar of Sanskrit. Ashtadhyayi in the 5th century BC. Panini grammar reflects an advanced understanding of the structure of language and was foundational in many ways. The textual cultural tradition of ancient India includes Sanskrit texts, Pali texts and Prakrit texts. Pali is associated with Buddhism and Prakrit with Jain tradition. Similarly, Valmiki's Ramayana is considered as the hallmark of early Sanskrit literature. Interestingly, the Sanskrit Valmiki Ramayana has parallels in Pali and Prakrit, Ramayana in Buddhist and Jain traditions respectively. In addition to this, the Sangam literature represents the earliest literature in Tamil language. Thus, one needs to see the continuity of orality and literacy in Indian society. Historians argue that stutis and prasastis were still recited, heard, and even were recorded in writing. There is a continuity of orality even after the emergence and advancement of literacy that still coexists. Hence, any understanding of cultural traditions in India has to be understood as a continuity of both oral and written traditions. The oral tradition was so effective that it guided literacy, and literacy followed orality. In this lecture, we outlined the relationship between culture and communication with the mode of survival of people in the different stages of history. Going by the formulation that culture is essentially communicational in nature, we have highlighted both symbolic and material aspects of culture and communication in ancient India. We also dealt with rich oral traditions that guided literacy and preserved orality in literacy. The point to stress is that communication is cultural and is embedded in the social relations. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you.